"You'll catch cold," she whispered, but the words shook harder than the wind. He stopped only long enough to look at her, really look, like he could see every fear she'd tried to bury since the night the world took everything from her. Then he placed his coat over her shoulders, firm and steady, the way a man does when he's already made a promise he hasn't spoken yet. "I can handle the cold," he said quietly. "What I can't handle is watching you stand out here pretending you're not hurting." Her breath caught. His didn't. The air tightened between them, filled with something neither of them dared to name, and just when she thought he might step back, he took one more step closer, lowering his voice to a truth she wasn't ready for but needed to hear. "You don't have to carry everything alone anymore." Snow sifted across the lonely stretch of Hollow Creek as dawn crept over the ridge, pale and exhausted. Evelyn Ward stood beside the fresh mound of earth behind her cabin, hands buried in her skirt to hide their trembling. The wooden marker she had carved through a sleepless night leaned slightly in the frozen soil, but she pressed it straight, refusing to let grief make even this small thing crooked. Her breath steamed in the cold, rising like a prayer she didn't have the strength to speak. It had been 3 days since her husband's fever had burned him hollow. 3 days since she had stopped expecting answers from the quiet house behind her. And 3 days since she had felt anything but the heavy ache sitting beneath her ribs. A thin wind curled around her ankles, carrying the faint scent of pine and distant smoke. She didn't turn. She didn't want to look at the world, yet not the stubborn dawn, not the cabin windows dark with loneliness, not the empty corral where his horse still paced, confused by the silence. But the land would not wait for her grief. By mid-morning, the cold tightened. Her fingers grew stiff around the spade she'd used to carve the last of the soil. She knew she should go inside, warm her hands, eat something. She also knew she wouldn't. She stayed because moving felt like betrayal. The crunch of distant hooves broke the stillness, steady, unhurried, confident. She straightened, breath snagging as the figure crested the snowy rise, a tall rider wrapped in a wind-bitten coat, hat pulled low, lantern strapped to his saddle, though daylight had already come. A stranger? No, not full stranger. She'd seen him once before, months back, riding the ridge road like a man chasing his own ghosts. He hadn't spoken then, just nodded from a distance with eyes that carried their own stories. Today, he didn't nod. He rode straight toward her. Evelyn's fingers found the small knife tucked in her apron. She didn't draw it. She wasn't that bold, but she felt the edge through the cloth, a trembling kind of reassurance. The horse stopped a few paces away, exhaling plumes into the cold. The man dismounted with the ease of someone who'd lived more years in the saddle than under any roof. When he removed his hat, she saw the scar along his temple, a pale, jagged line like lightning, frozen in skin. "Mrs. Ward," he said quietly. Her name on his tongue startled her. Her husband must have spoken of her during trade, or perhaps in the valley word traveled faster than she realized. "My name's Calder Hayes," he continued. "I rode through at dawn. Thought someone ought to know there's trouble cutting across the lower creek." Evelyn swallowed. Trouble. He glanced toward the tree line, jaw tightening. "Raiders, hungry ones. Smoke signals near the marsh. They don't usually wander this far north unless they've run out of easier targets." The breath she drew felt sharp in her chest. "And you're warning me why?" Calder shifted, but not uncomfortably, more like a man choosing his next words with care. "Because you're alone out here, and because your chimney wasn't burning last night." She stiffened. "You were watching my chimney. I was watching the valley," he corrected softly. "Your cabin just happens to be in it." Silence pressed between them, snowflakes caught in her hair, melting faster than she could brush them away. She wanted to tell him she was fine, that she had lived through enough darkness to handle a few shadows on the horizon. But her voice said something else entirely. "My husband died 3 days ago. Calder's gaze lowered for just a breath, respectful, steady. "I'm sorry for your loss." Grief flickered behind her eyes. "I don't need help. Maybe not." His tone didn't challenge her, it simply existed, level and calm as the winter air. But raiders don't care who needs help. The wind shifted, carrying a faint crack like snapped firewood far off in the woods. Calder heard it too. His hand brushed the revolver at his hip, a motion practiced enough to look like breathing. "You should gather what you can," he said. "If they come up that creek bed, this place won't hold." Her pulse quickened. "I'm not leaving my home, not forever." His voice softened, just long enough to stay alive. She turned away, the grief inside her twisting like a knot pulled too tight. The idea of leaving, of abandoning the last footprint her husband left behind, felt unbearable. Every floorboard held a memory. Every tool in the shed still carried the warmth of his hands. "I buried him here," she whispered. "I won't ride away from him." Calder didn't speak for a long moment. The quiet felt almost like warmth, the kind that doesn't comfort but steadies. Finally he stepped forward, boots sinking into the snow beside her. "Then let me help you defend this place until morning," he said. "Just one night, one." She should have refused, but loneliness had a way of dissolving stubbornness, and fear had already begun to gnaw at the edges of her resolve. She met his gaze, noticing for the first time the fatigue shadowing his features, the kind born from long nights, long roads, and ghosts that walked with a man whether he wanted them there or not. "One night," she murmured. He nodded once, a slow, respectful promise. One night. By late afternoon, the light began to fade, turning the snow a muted silver. Evelyn pulled her shawl tighter, trying to push through the numbness in her fingers as she gathered firewood. Calder worked in silence nearby, inspecting the cabin's old shutters, tightening the latch on her back door, testing boards that had long since grown soft. He didn't ask to come inside. He didn't ask about her husband. He didn't fill the air with words meant to ease a wound that had no intention of healing quickly. And maybe that was why she didn't tell him to leave. When the sun finally slipped behind the ridge, Evelyn felt the prickle of unease the valley often carried after dark, the feeling of being watched by the quiet. Calder must have sensed it too. He moved closer, not looming, just present. "You should rest," he said. "I'll take first watch. I won't sleep. Then close your eyes," he murmured, "and let the dark think you are." The way he said it, not unkind, not commanding, made something soften just slightly inside her. She hesitated before entering the cabin, pausing at the threshold as if crossing it would make her grief fresher. Behind her, Calder stood like a silent sentinel, the cold settling around him, the valley holding its breath. And for the first time since the grave soil cooled, Evelyn felt the smallest shift inside her chest, not hope, not trust, something gentler, something tired. Perhaps it was simply the relief of not being alone. That night the wind changed, and somewhere far off in the timber, a single echo carried across the frozen creek, the faint metallic click of a rifle being cocked. Evelyn didn't hear it. Calder did. And he didn't move from her door until morning. Morning rose with a thin, reluctant light, stretching across the valley like it wasn't sure it wanted to touch the frozen world below. Evelyn stepped outside with her shawl tight around her shoulders, breath blooming in pale clouds as she scanned the tree line. The night had been long, too long, and the weight of unsaid worries still hung between her ribs like cold iron. Calder stood where she had last seen him, boots planted firm in the half-packed snow. He hadn't slept. She could tell by the tightened set of his jaw and the faint exhaustion shadowing his eyes. Yet he faced the morning like a man who had already braced for whatever the next hour might demand. "Anything?" she asked quietly. He shook his head once, quiet, "Not sure I trust it." She didn't either. Silence could be kindness in summer. In winter, it was usually a warning. Evelyn moved toward the small shed, gathering the courage it took to act normal. Calder followed at a slight distance, not hovering, not intruding, simply there in the same steady way the mountains were. She hated how grateful she was for that steadiness, how much her hands trembled whenever she set them to a task she used to do without thinking. He noticed, he didn't comment. By mid-morning, clouds thickened along the ridge, a sign of more snow, maybe, or a sign of something else. Calder checked the empty corral, studied the ground with the quiet patience of a man who'd tracked danger longer than most folks lived. Evelyn watched him crouch near the fence. See something? He brushed frost from the earth, revealing a faint impression filled with ice, boot print, not mine, not yours. Her pulse caught. How old? Less than a day. The words tasted like dread. She drew her shawl tighter, though it didn't help. The air felt different now. Thinner, sharper, like it was listening. Calder rose slowly, scanning the valley. They're close. Maybe scouting, maybe testing how deep you sleep. Evelyn's stomach knotted. I should have heard something. You were grieving, he said gently. That's not a weakness. Her throat tightened. She didn't know how to argue with that, so she didn't. Instead, she crossed her arms, staring at the distant hills where shadows moved in ways she didn't trust. Why are you really helping me? She asked. Calder didn't flinch. Because danger coming through Hollow Creek doesn't discriminate. You're alone. And because a man pays for looking away when he could have stepped in. The way he said it, quiet, honest, almost painful, made her realize his past wasn't something he carried so much as something that clung to him. Before she could speak, a sound cracked through the valley. Sharp, sudden, not wind, not branches, a gunshot. Evelyn jerked, but Calder was already moving, pulling her behind the thick post of the shed, body angled between her and the open stretch of snow. His voice dropped low, steady as bedrock. Stay close. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears. Was that closer than it should be? He scanned the woods. Someone's testing distance. The realization chilled her deeper than the winter air ever could. This wasn't random danger drifting across the prairie. This was deliberate. Someone was watching her home, watching her. Calder's hand hovered near his revolver, thumb loose but ready. They're not here for supplies, he murmured. They're seeing who steps outside. Evelyn's voice barely found shape. You think they're watching right now? I don't think, he said softly. I know. Wind swept across the ridge, bending branches and scattering loose snow. She felt exposed, as if every breath she took echoed into the woods. Calder stepped slightly forward, shielding her from that invisible gaze she could almost feel on her skin. You can't stay here tonight, he said. Not with prints that fresh and rifles testing distance. She shook her head, fighting the instinct to cling to the comfort of familiarity. This is my home. It's also a target, he replied, and a quiet cabin is easier to burn than defend. The words struck her like cold water. She looked at the grave behind the cabin, the freshly carved marker that had already become a part of her heartbeat. Leaving it behind felt wrong. Leaving felt like another death. Calder saw her hesitation. His voice lowered, softer but no less firm. I'm not asking you to forget him. I'm asking you to stay alive. The valley held a long, brittle silence between them. Evelyn exhaled shakily. Where would we go? There's an old trail heading north, he said. Steeper, but safer. They don't search high ground in winter. She repeated. He met her eyes steady. I'm not letting you ride out alone. She didn't know whether to be comforted or afraid of how quickly she believed him. The distant echo of something metal clattered through the woods. Maybe a loose canteen, maybe the shift of a rifle being slung. Whatever it was too close. Evelyn swallowed hard. Then we leave at first light. Calder shook his head. We leave before the sun gives them a clear shot. She closed her eyes, gathering the courage she hadn't known she'd need so soon. When she opened them again, she nodded. Calder didn't smile. He only touched the brim of his hat, the gesture quieter than a promise but heavier than reassurance. 1 hour, he said. Pack only what you need. As Evelyn stepped inside the cabin to gather her things, she felt the shift the moment grief loosened its hold just enough for fear and survival to take its place. Outside, Calder stood watch, unmoving. The wind changed again, and somewhere in the timber, someone changed with it. Dawn climbed slowly over Hollow Creek, thin as parchment and twice as fragile. Evelyn stood in the doorway of her cabin with her small travel bag clutched against her chest, breath unsteady as she looked over everything she was about to leave behind. Frost dusted the window frames. Her husband's boots still rested beside the hearth. The fresh grave behind the house lay quiet beneath a silver veil of snow. She knew they had to go. Knowing didn't make it easier. Calder waited near the corral, saddling his horse with deliberate, measured motions. He gave her space, not out of indifference, but out of understanding. Some goodbyes needed silence more than comfort. Evelyn stepped down from the porch, the boards creaking beneath her feet, as though the house itself were reluctant to let her go. The cold bit at her cheeks, sharper than yesterday, or maybe it was the grief making everything feel thinner. "You ready?" Calder asked, voice low. She swallowed hard, "As I'll ever be." He studied her for a heartbeat, then nodded. "We'll keep to the ridge trail. They won't expect us to climb before noon." Evelyn glanced toward the tall pines shadowing the creek bed. The air seemed heavier there, weighted with the memory of yesterday's gunshot. She half expected figures to emerge from the tree line, but the woods remained still, too still, as if hiding breath behind bark. Calder offered his hand to help her mount the mare he'd prepared for her. She hesitated only a moment before taking it. His grip was steady, warm despite the cold, grounding her enough to swing into the saddle. For a long minute, neither of them moved. She looked back one last time. The cabin stood small and lonely against the white stretch of earth, chimney cold, shutters drawn. It had been her world, quiet and simple, filled with shared laughter and winter chores, and the gentle certainty of a husband she'd thought she'd grow old beside. Now it was a memory dressed as a house. Calder waited without urging her. She felt the weight of his patience, the respectful kind that didn't press or hurry. It made the goodbye hurt in a strangely softer way. "I don't know what it'll feel like when we ride away," she whispered. "Then don't try to feel it all at once," he said. "Just breathe." So she did, one breath, then another. When she finally turned her mare away from the cabin, her chest tightened like something inside her wanted to break. But Calder rode beside her, a constant shape in the corner of her vision, and the breaking eased into something she could carry. They crossed the small stretch of open snow quickly, heading toward the narrow path hugging the hillside. Frost cracked beneath the horses' hooves. The wind brushed against their coats, lifting loose strands of Evelyn's hair. Calder rode slightly ahead now, eyes scanning the valley below with the wary calm of a man who trusted instinct more than luck. "Tracks are old here," he murmured without turning. "Day or two maybe. We're clear for now." Evelyn nodded even though he couldn't see her. "Do you think they'll come after us?" "If they knew you were here alone, maybe," he said. "But it's harder to track two riders who know where they're going." "Do you?" she asked, too quickly, too honestly. Calder's shoulders rose with a slow breath. "I know enough." A simple answer, a guarded one. She didn't press. She still didn't know what ghosts shadowed the edges of his quiet, but she could feel them walking beside him. By late morning, the ridge trail steepened. The valley below disappeared beneath a rising curtain of white fog, leaving them in an isolated stretch of higher ground. Evelyn clung to the saddle horn as her mare climbed, muscles trembling beneath her. Calder glanced over. "You doing all right?" "Trying," she said through gritted teeth. "That's enough." The trail leveled briefly, giving them a moment's ease. Evelyn exhaled, letting her fingers loosen from their tight grip. The air was colder here, sharper, but oddly cleaner, as if the higher wind knew nothing of the danger lurking below. For the first time since morning broke, she let her eyes drift toward Calder fully. Snow clung to the edges of his coat. His jaw was unshaven, darkened by a rough night without rest, and yet he rode like he belonged on this path, like he was carved from the same grit as the mountains around them. She wondered how long he'd been living this way, half soldier, half ghost, wholly alone. Calder, she said quietly. He lifted his gaze to meet hers. Thank you for not letting me stay behind. A shadow crossed his expression, something like regret, something like relief. A loss makes folks stick to places that don't keep them safe. Doesn't mean you should have to face danger on your own. Evelyn's voice softened. You didn't even know me. I didn't need to. That was all he said, but it lingered in the space between them like a truth she wasn't ready to unpack. By midday, the fog thinned enough to reveal distant slopes and narrow passes. Calder slowed his horse as the trail bent sharply along the cliffside. The drop was steep, jagged with boulders and ice. Evelyn tightened her grip. This safe? Safer than the valley, he replied. Raiders don't like high ground, harder to ride in packs up here. She tried to steady her breathing, each exhale harsh in the cold. The mare hesitated at the turn. Calder reached over, brushing his hand along the horse's muzzle, murmuring something wordless but calming. Evelyn was surprised by how gentle he could be with so few words. They continued forward, the path narrow enough that Evelyn could hear the subtle unevenness in Calder's breathing, fatigue catching up with him. He had kept watch the entire night, she realized, not for himself. For her, a small ache formed behind her ribs, unfamiliar and unwelcome. Afternoon settled softly around them, the sky dimming with the promise of more snow. Evelyn's hands began to numb despite her gloves. The ache of loss pressed into her again, sharper this time, as if distance from her home made grief echo louder. Calder slowed his horse slightly, matching her pace. We'll stop soon, he said. There's a sheltered rise ahead, good for the horses. She nodded, grateful for the pause, grateful for the steady cadence of his voice cutting through the wind. When the trail broadened, they finally dismounted. Evelyn stretched her aching legs, steadying herself against the saddle. Calder loosened the cinch and checked the mare's hooves with practiced care. You did well, he said softly. She wasn't sure if he meant her or the horse. She didn't ask. The wind shifted again, colder, brushing against their coats with a whispered urgency. Calder straightened slowly, scanning the ridge below. We made distance, he murmured, but danger doesn't always come from behind. Evelyn followed his gaze. The valley lay hidden beneath gray cloud. The world looked vast, and she had never felt so small, but she wasn't alone, not anymore. Calder stepped closer, not touching, not assuming, simply standing where she could feel his presence cut through the growing dusk. Tonight, he said quietly, we keep moving. Tomorrow we find shelter. His voice held no fear, only promise. And Evelyn, with grief still tender in her chest, found the strength to nod. That night, the sky dimmed early, and the first flakes of a heavier storm began to fall as they continued their slow climb into the uncertain high country. She stood by the barn door, arms folded tight, trying to look composed, but her voice betrayed her the moment he stepped into the light. "Why are you still here?" she asked, softer than she meant to. Most men would have ridden on by now. He dusted off his gloves, calm as ever. Most men don't see what I see. She swallowed. And what exactly do you think you see? He took a slow breath, the kind that made her heartbeat jump even before he spoke. A woman who's been holding her world together with shaking hands and pretending they're steady. Her jaw tightened. You don't know anything about me. I know you don't sleep, he replied, I hear you walking the floors at night. I know you jump every time the wind hits the shutters, and I know you're scared of something you refuse to name." Her eyes flashed, equal parts anger and fear. "You think you can fix me, is that it?" "No," he said, stepping closer. "I think you've been trying to fix yourself alone for too damn long." She looked away, blinking fast, because he wasn't wrong and the truth of it hurt more than the memories did. "What if I told you I don't want anyone's help?" she whispered. He shook his head. "Then I'd still stay right here, because wanting help and needing help are two very different things, and you deserve the kind you've never had." Her breath hitched. For a moment she couldn't speak, couldn't look at him, couldn't decide whether he was the most infuriating or the most necessary man she'd ever met. And then he added, low and steady, "You don't owe me a damn thing, but I'm not walking away." Something inside her cracked, quiet, unseen, but real. And for the first time, she didn't tell him to leave. The house was quiet, but the kind of quiet that feels heavy, like the walls were holding secrets neither of them dared to say out loud. She tried to keep busy, wiping down a table that was already clean, pretending she didn't notice him leaning against the doorway, watching her with that steady look that always unsettled her. "You ain't slept," he said finally. She didn't turn, didn't realize you were keeping track. "I'm not," he answered. "Your eyes are." Her hands stilled. He walked closer, slow enough to give her room to push him away, but she didn't. She just stared at the wood grain beneath her palms like it could hide the truth. "It was bad last night, wasn't it?" he asked. She sucked in a sharp breath. "It doesn't matter." "It does, no," she snapped, louder than she meant to, "because talking doesn't change anything." He didn't react to her anger, just lowered his voice. "It changes the weight. Doesn't make it disappear, but it's lighter when you're not carrying it alone." Her throat tightened. "I don't know how to do that." "Then let me show you." That made her finally look at him. Really look. The sincerity in his eyes hit her harder than any memory ever did. "You think I'm strong enough for that?" she whispered. "I think you're stronger than you've ever been told." Her breath trembled, the first sign of the storm she'd held in for years. "I almost broke last night," she admitted, voice cracking like a worn saddle strap. "I sat on the floor and I couldn't breathe." He stepped closer, just close enough for his presence to steady the air around her. "You didn't break," he said. "You survived." She closed her eyes, letting that sink in slow, painful true. "And if it happens again," he added, "I'll be here not to pull you out, but to sit with you until you can stand on your own." For the first time, she didn't argue. For the first time, she let the truth settle instead of fighting it. And for the first time, she didn't feel entirely alone. Dawn crept over the ridge, pale and slow, finding him already outside, tightening the saddle strap like a man fighting a decision he didn't want to make. She stepped onto the porch, arms wrapped around herself, not from the cold, but from the question she'd been holding in all night. "You're leaving?" It wasn't asked, it was stated. He didn't turn, didn't say that. "You didn't have to." Silence stretched between them, the kind that pulled tighter the longer neither of them spoke. Finally, he let out a breath. "I got word yesterday. There's trouble stirring 2 towns over. A man I used to ride with, he's mixed up in it." Her heartbeat dropped. "So you're running toward danger again." "It's what I know." "And what about what happened here?" she pressed. "What about last night? What about everything you've been saying to me?" He closed his eyes for a moment, jaw clenching. "That's the problem," he said quietly. "I didn't plan on caring this much." She froze. Those words hit harder than any gunshot ever could. He turned then, finally, and she saw it, the conflict, the fear. "The truth, you make me want to stay," he said. "And wanting to stay, that's dangerous for a man like me." Her voice was barely a whisper. "Why?" "Because if someone comes looking for me, And they will. Anyone close to me becomes a target. Her breath faltered. So you think leaving protects me? It keeps you alive. She stepped off the porch, closing the distance between them with more courage than she felt. You listen to me, she said. I've lived scared for years, long before you showed up. And for the first time, I don't wake up feeling like I'm drowning. You did that, not by saving me, but by being here. His eyes softened, the first crack in the shield he wore around his chest. I don't want you hurt because of me, he whispered, and I don't want you gone because of fear that isn't yours to carry alone. He looked away, swallowing hard. You shouldn't tie your hope to a man who's spent most of his life running. Then stop running. Her words hung in the cold morning air, impossible to ignore, impossible to answer without breaking something inside him. He took a step back, not away from her, but away from what he wanted. I need time, he said. She nodded, though it clearly hurt. Then take it, but don't mistake silence for distance. You're part of this place now, whether you admit it or not. He didn't reply. He couldn't. But as he mounted his horse, he looked at her one last time, the kind of look a man gives when he's already decided he'll come back, even if he hasn't said it out loud. And she stood there, watching him ride toward the horizon, knowing one truth clearer than ever. He wasn't leaving to abandon her. He was leaving because caring for her terrified him more than any bullet ever could. The wind had picked up by nightfall, rattling the thin boards of the cabin and sweeping icy needles across the frozen ground outside. Evelyn sat close to the fire, knees drawn under her shawl, staring into the flames, but seeing nothing but the shadow of her grief. She could hear Calder moving quietly near the back door, boots soft, every sound measured and deliberate. He didn't speak, not yet, letting the silence stretch like a taut wire between them. Finally, the wind cracked a loose branch against the roof. Evelyn flinched, and without looking, Calder was beside her, sitting on the edge of the hearth. His shadow stretched long and steady across the floorboards. You're not sleeping, he observed, his voice calm as the wind. Too much on your mind. She shook her head. I've been thinking about everything, about him, about this valley, about leaving it all behind. Calder's gaze softened, but his tone stayed steady. You think you're the only one with ghosts. Evelyn glanced at him, startled. You have ghosts. He didn't answer right away. The wind rattled again, shaking the cabin's shutters. Then he reached up, brushing a hand over the scar on his temple, a pale line cutting through his weathered skin. This, he said quietly, it's not from war, not from the fight most people assume. It's from someone I trusted, someone who thought they could break me by breaking everyone I cared about. Her throat tightened. I'm sorry. He shook his head. Don't be, that was a long time ago. But it teaches you something. The wind tells you more than words ever can. It knows when danger is near. It knows who will stay when all else falls away. She studied him, noticing the quiet weight in his shoulders, the way his eyes lingered on the flickering flames rather than the space between them. And you stayed, she whispered. Yes, he replied. Even when the wind was harsh, even when it was easier to walk away. The fire popped, sending sparks into the darkness. Evelyn reached out instinctively, fingers brushing the edge of his coat, as if seeking a thread of warmth she didn't realize she needed. Calder didn't pull away. He simply let the moment exist, letting the wind outside carry its message while the fire carried theirs. I don't know how to, she started, voice breaking, how to keep moving when everything feels like it's falling apart. You do it one step at a time, he said. And you do it with someone beside you, if they're willing to walk through the storm. That's all it takes. For a long while, neither spoke. The wind rattled. The fire whispered. The past lingered, but for the first time, it felt less like a weight and more like a map, guiding them through the night. And as the shadows stretched across the cabin walls, Evelyn realized She wasn't just listening to the wind anymore. She was learning from it. The wind knew more than she had ever admitted. And maybe, just maybe, so did Calder. The river stretched before them, half frozen, its dark water whispering against jagged sheets of ice. Evelyn shivered, not entirely from the cold, but from the sense of something unpredictable hiding beneath the thin, cracking surface. Calder dismounted first, standing at the river's edge, boots sinking into the snow-soaked mud. His eyes scanned the flow, measuring the distance, the strength, the danger in ways only a man who had ridden through life's harshest currents could understand. "You'll need to trust me," he said quietly, almost as if speaking to the river itself. "Step where I step, don't hesitate." Her hands tightened on the reins. "I don't trust ice," she admitted. "I don't trust it either," he said, offering her his hand, "but sometimes survival demands it." She looked at him, seeing the calm discipline in his stance. Not arrogance, not bravado, a quiet certainty, and something else, an unspoken promise she couldn't yet name. The first step was tentative. The ice groaned beneath her mare's hooves. The river tried to pull at them with its icy fingers, whispering threats she couldn't understand, testing resolve. She glanced at Calder, who led the way, careful, deliberate, a steadying presence. A sudden slip. Her heart stopped as her mare's hoof slid against the ice. She felt herself tipping toward the frigid water, panic biting like the river's current. Calder was there instantly, catching the reins, his hand pressing firm against her shoulder. The warmth of his touch cut through the fear, anchoring her. "Hold on," he said. "Don't fight it. Just trust." Her chest heaved as adrenaline coursed through her veins. Step by step, guided by his quiet voice and steady hands, they crossed the treacherous stretch. The river's roar was loud, but somehow his presence made it manageable, almost bearable. Each movement was careful, measured. Each breath a reminder that she wasn't alone. When they finally reached the far bank, the snow muffled the sound of rushing water behind them. Evelyn slid from her mare, knees trembling, and stumbled slightly into Calder's side. He steadied her without a word, just the weight of his body against hers, a shield against the world. "You're safe," he murmured, voice low, steady, for now. Her hands rested against his chest, feeling the rhythm of his heart. She hadn't realized how much she had wanted someone to be there when the cold, the fear, and the weight of loss threatened to pull her under. I almost fell," she admitted, voice shaking. "And yet you're still standing," he replied. "Stronger than you think." She pulled back slightly, taking in the sight of the river behind them. Dark, relentless, unyielding. Yet here she was, on solid ground, because he had guided her through it. His eyes met hers, and for a heartbeat, words were unnecessary. The closeness, the trust, the quiet intensity between them said more than any conversation ever could. For the first time since leaving Hollow Creek, Evelyn allowed herself to exhale fully, and she realized that some rivers, no matter how icy or treacherous, could be crossed when you weren't alone. Calder remained at her side, watching the river with quiet vigilance, ready for whatever came next, while she, still shivering from the cold and the near fall, understood something profound. Fear was bearable when someone else carried part of it with you. Evelyn sat at the edge of the cabin's worn table, hands trembling slightly as she unfolded the delicate paper her husband had left behind. The ink had faded with time, but the words remained, deliberate and tender, carrying the weight of the man she had loved and lost. She traced each line with her fingertip, feeling the curve of his hand in the loops of letters, as if the paper itself could speak the warmth he once carried. Her chest tightened, a knot of grief and longing coiling within her. "I can't," she whispered to herself, though her voice cracked under the weight of memory. She had avoided opening it, afraid the finality of his words would break her in ways the fever hadn't already. Calder watched silently from across the room, leaning against the doorframe. He said nothing, knowing better than to intrude. There was a sacredness in this moment, a fragile bridge between past and present. She read aloud softly, the words barely audible over the wind rattling the cabin's shutters. Every sentence pulled at her heart, every phrase a reminder of the life she had once known. Tears ran unchecked, and she blinked rapidly to keep her vision clear. "I promise to always find you in every sunrise," she murmured, voice catching. "Even when I'm gone." Calder's chest tightened, not because of the words themselves, but because he felt the depth of her loss. He had learned long ago that grief was not a thing to fix. It was a river to navigate with patience and presence. Evelyn lowered the letter, her hands trembling as if holding it made the grief heavier. "He knew me," she said, almost to herself. "He knew me better than anyone ever will." Calder stepped closer, careful not to crowd her. "He loved you," he said quietly, "and it shows every word." Her eyes lifted to him, a mix of sorrow and vulnerability reflected back. "And yet, I feel like I'm betraying him just by surviving." "You're not," Calder replied, voice steady and gentle. "Living doesn't betray anyone, moving forward, slowly, that's how we honor what was lost." She let out a shuddering breath, clutching the letter to her chest, trying to fold the past into something bearable. Calder didn't reach for her. He didn't offer platitudes. He only stood there, a steady presence in the quiet cabin, letting her grief unfold without judgment. Finally, she folded the letter and placed it beside her, as though setting a small part of her heart back into the world. She looked at Calder, uncertain if she wanted comfort or solitude, and found neither. She only found the quiet truth that perhaps, for the first time in weeks, she didn't feel entirely alone. The wind outside carried a faint moan through the cracks in the cabin walls. Evelyn hugged herself, letting the silence fill the space between sorrow and hope. Calder's gaze remained unwavering, a silent vow that he would walk with her through both. And in that moment she understood. The past was a letter, yes, but the present, this fragile, uncertain now, was hers to live. The night stretched long and still, and for the first time, Evelyn allowed herself to breathe without shame. The ridge smelled of smoke before they saw it. Calder's horse halted mid-step, nostrils flaring as the acrid haze drifted across the cold air. Evelyn clutched the reins tighter, chest tight with unease, while the valley below shimmered with orange flames licking at timber and thatched roofs. Settlements, families, lives built quietly in the wintered hollows, now in danger. "Raiders," Calder murmured, voice low and steady. His eyes scanned the ridge, sharp as hawks. "They hit quick, take what they can carry and vanish before anyone reacts." Evelyn felt bile rise, helplessness squeezing her throat. We should warn them," she said, voice breaking. People are down there." Calder shook his head slowly. "It's too late to reach them before they're gone. We can't stop them from burning the past, but we can keep ourselves alive." Her jaw tightened, anger flaring through her grief. "We can't just run, not while others suffer." He met her gaze, voice hard but measured. "Survival doesn't mean abandoning kindness. It means making sure we live to protect those we can help later. Right now, that's you." The firelight from below painted their faces in flickering shadows. Evelyn swallowed, the truth of his words pressing like the winter wind. She wanted to argue, to insist she could fight, she could stay. But the panic rising in her chest, sharp and relentless, spoke louder than pride. Calder stepped closer, hand brushing hers briefly on the reins. "I'll lead, you follow. The ridge will shield us longer than the valley floor." The mare snorted, sensing the tension in the air. Evelyn felt the cold settle deeper, biting at exposed skin, as she swung into motion beside him. Every step upward was a step away from the world she knew, and yet each step carried the weight of choice, survival or stubborn attachment. Smoke rose in thick columns, carrying cries that barely reached them over the wind. Evelyn's fingers tightened on the reins. She had buried grief already. Now she faced helplessness layered atop it. Calder's eyes flicked back at her, sharp, commanding. "Don't look down. Don't let the heat and chaos pull you back. Focus on the trail. She obeyed, forcing her gaze forward. Yet the images of fire and loss burned in her mind, a haunting echo of all she had left behind. By mid-afternoon, they had climbed high enough to leave the smoke behind. The wind carried it away from them, and the valley became a muted expanse of white and ash below. Evelyn exhaled slowly, though her hands still trembled. "You did well," Calder said quietly. "You didn't look back when it mattered most." Her eyes met his, reflecting the muted sunset and the weight of unspoken truths. I couldn't stay," she admitted, voice soft. "Not alone, not knowing if I could survive the night." He nodded once, stoic and silent. No one survives alone. The wind shifted again, cold and insistent, pushing them forward along the ridge. Evelyn's heart still ached for the lives below, but she felt the first flicker of resolve return. Survival didn't erase grief. It honored it by allowing her to continue, and Calder, ever steady, remained beside her, a presence she no longer questioned, only relied upon. The ridge stretched ahead, endless and uncertain, and the smoke of yesterday's world became a distant memory as the path forward demanded their full attention. The wind carried a bitter tang that made Calder's eyes narrow as they rode along the high ridge. He had grown accustomed to watching for threats in the shadows of the frontier, but something about the tracks in the snow today unsettled him. They weren't random, too precise, too deliberate. A mark caught his eye on a discarded piece of raider gear lying half, buried in a drift-swept hollow. His chest tightened. The symbol, etched crudely into the leather, burned recognition into his memory. A gang he had thought long gone, faces and betrayals he'd tried to forget. The ones who had torn through his past, leaving nothing but scars behind. Evelyn noticed his pause. "What is it?" she asked softly. He didn't answer immediately, only ran a gloved hand over the mark again, tracing it like it might speak to him. His jaw clenched, a shadow crossing his face that she hadn't seen before. This is them," he said finally, "the same gang that took everything I once trusted." Her stomach twisted. Then, "They're close, yes." His voice was steady, but the tension in his hands betrayed him. "Closer than I want. I've tried to outrun them for years, thought I could leave the past buried, but some things follow you, no matter the distance." Evelyn felt a cold realization settle over her. "And now we're caught in it too." Calder nodded slowly. "I won't let history repeat itself, not with you, not here, but I won't lie. This makes things complicated." The ridge ahead narrowed, and snow drifted across the path, masking fresh tracks that led into the pines below. Calder scanned them, calculating, cautious. His mind churned, juggling the ghosts of betrayal with the reality of protecting someone who had nothing but faith in him. She reached out instinctively, her hand brushing his arm. "What do we do?" He looked down at her, the weight of the past and the promise of the present in his gaze. "We survive, we stay ahead, and we trust that our choices matter more than theirs." Evelyn exhaled slowly, shivering in the cold, the shadow of his words sinking in. This was no longer just a flight for safety. It was a confrontation with history, one that threatened to shatter the fragile bond forming between them. By evening, the wind carried whispers of movement from the valley below. Calder's eyes scanned the horizon, sharp and unyielding, and he pressed a finger to his lips. "We ride quietly, we watch, and we don't underestimate them." The ridge stretched before them, white and endless. Every step, every hoof beat carried the weight of survival and vengeance. Evelyn rode close, silent, trusting him with the fragile thread of hope she had clung to since leaving Hollow Creek. The past had returned, but so had determination. And somewhere between the snow and the shadows, Calder and Evelyn learned that facing betrayal meant standing together, even when the wind itself seemed to push against them. That night, as the ridge darkened and the cold deepened, she realized fear had a name. And so did courage. Calder remained beside her, steadfast, a silent promise in the unyielding frontier. The fire in the cabin was more shadow than warmth that evening, flickering against the rough timber and painting long lines across their faces. Evelyn paced the small space, boots scuffing softly against the worn floorboards, while Calder stood near the door, rifle across his knees, eyes on the snow-swept horizon outside. The tension between them was a tangible thing, heavier than the cold that seeped in through the cracks. "You think I'm running from ghosts," she said at last, voice sharp with frustration. "But maybe you're the one hiding. You think you can face the past alone, and I'm supposed to just accept that." Calder's jaw tightened. "I'm not running. I'm surviving, and right now, that means keeping you alive, even when you don't want to be kept." Kept. Her laugh was bitter. "Is that what this is to you? Protecting me? Or is it about making yourself feel like a hero in someone else's story?" He rose slowly, voice low but firm. "It's about doing the right thing, whether you see it or not. You can call it heroism if it makes you feel better. I call it responsibility." She shook her head, frustration bleeding into fear. "Responsibility doesn't keep the past from catching up with you. It doesn't stop what's coming, and neither does running blindly." He shot back. "You cling to grief like it's a shield. I can't fight your past for you, Evelyn. You have to let it go, even a little." The wind rattled the shutters, punctuating their argument. For a heartbeat, the cabin felt smaller than ever, a trap of tension and unspoken truths. Evelyn's hands trembled, not entirely from the cold. Calder's eyes softened for a fleeting moment, but his posture remained rigid, controlled. Before another word could be spoken, a sudden sound shattered the fragile quiet. A branch snapped outside, followed by the crunch of boots on snow. Both of them froze, raiders. Calder's hand moved instinctively to his rifle, eyes scanning the dim interior before locking on hers. Evelyn's breath hitched, fear and adrenaline surging through her. "Stay behind me," he commanded, voice low but unwavering. They moved together, a single unit, the argument momentarily forgotten in the face of immediate danger. The world outside had no concern for grudges or lingering fears. It demanded survival. The shadows shifted. One, two figures moved among the trees, closer than they should have been. Calder's aim was steady, practiced, and his presence beside her became both shield and anchor. Evelyn's heart pounded, but she felt an unfamiliar clarity in the chaos. Despite their fight, despite their differences, they were bound by necessity and trust. The intruders paused at the tree line, and then, as silently as they had arrived, they melted back into the dark. Evelyn exhaled slowly, leaning slightly against Calder. "That was too close," she whispered. He nodded, lowering the rifle but not his vigilance. "Closer than I like, but we survived." She looked at him, the anger of moments before melting into exhaustion and something quieter, respect, maybe even a fragile understanding. "You think we can survive the rest of this?" Calder met her gaze steadily. "If we stay together, yes, and if we don't let the past divide us any further." Outside, the wind howled against the cabin, carrying the promise of more trials ahead. Inside, two hearts wrestled with anger, fear, and a slow, unspoken realization. Survival wasn't just about facing the world. It was about facing each other, flaws and all. That night, as snow began to settle over the ridge, Evelyn understood that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was choosing trust, even when the heart was divided. The cold had settled deep into the cabin by the time Calder finally sank to the floor, leaning against the wall with a faint sheen of blood marring his sleeve. Evelyn knelt beside him, hands trembling as she pressed torn cloth to the wound, heart hammering in a rhythm she couldn't quiet. His breathing was ragged, shallow in the way that made her stomach twist with panic. "You'll be fine," she whispered, voice breaking. "You have to be." "I will," he rasped, trying to ease her fear with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Just breathe." She did, forcing herself to inhale and exhale despite the icy fear gripping her. Every flinch, every shiver of pain from him made her own pulse spike, her chest aching with the knowledge that he might not survive the night. And yet, through the blur of terror, a strange clarity emerged. She had to stay steady for him. She had to hold on, even if the world outside had already given up. Hours stretched slowly. Snow drifted against the cabin walls, the wind a distant howl that barely reached them inside. Evelyn kept her hands pressed against his wound, murmuring words she didn't even realize she knew she had. Soft, steady, promises of presence and survival. Calder's hand, warm and rough, brushed hers occasionally, an anchor in the darkness. "You're strong," he whispered between shallow breaths. "Stronger than you know." "I'm not strong enough to lose you," she admitted, voice trembling. "Not again." He gave a faint chuckle, almost inaudible, before a wince of pain stole it away. "You already carry enough to survive," he said. "I'm just a lesson in patience." Her heart clenched. She pressed closer, wrapping her arms around him despite the blood and cold, not caring about the filth or danger. She whispered stories of the valley, of past winters, of a life that could exist beyond this night, hoping the words would anchor him, will him to remain. Minutes became hours. Each shallow exhale from him was a victory. Each blink, each twitch of a finger, a testament to resilience. She refused to leave his side, refusing even the temptation to close her eyes, fearing if she did, she might wake to emptiness. By dawn, the storm outside had abated slightly, the snow lighter against the cabin walls. Calder's breathing had steadied, faint but stronger than before. Evelyn allowed herself a shaky exhale, relief coursing through her, though her arms ached from holding him upright all night. "You're still here," she whispered, a mixture of wonder and disbelief in her tone. "I promised," he murmured, voice hoarse but resolute, "and I always keep my promises." She let herself lean against him fully now, allowing tears to fall freely. Not just for the night's terror, not just for the injury, but for the first time in months, for the knowledge that she wasn't alone. The sun rose pale and cold outside, brushing snow across the ridge and bathing the cabin in muted gold. Evelyn held him still, heart full, mind racing with gratitude and a fragile hope that somehow they had survived the long night together, and maybe, just maybe, they could survive anything the future dared to throw at them. And in that quiet, exhausted moment, she realized that holding on wasn't just about survival. It was about connection, trust, and the willingness to stand with someone even when the world outside had already turned to chaos. For the first time since leaving Hollow Creek, Evelyn allowed herself to hope. Morning came pale and fragile, spilling through the cracks in the cabin walls. Calder lay against the rough timber, bandages snug, breathing steady, his eyes half closed in exhaustion. Evelyn sat beside him, fingers brushing over his hand with a mixture of relief and something deeper she hadn't named aloud. The long night had tested them both, but he had survived, and that fact pressed against her chest like a heartbeat she could finally feel. "I was afraid," she whispered, voice trembling, "afraid I'd lose someone again, afraid of letting you go." Calder's eyes opened slowly, meeting hers with a calm that belied the pain of his wounds. "And yet you stayed," he said, voice rough, "even when it was hard, even when it could have broken you." She swallowed, the weight of months of grief pressing against her. I didn't think I could keep going without him, without my husband, but—" her voice faltered. "I couldn't bear to lose you too." He shifted slightly, wincing but refusing to move away. "You don't have to carry everything alone, Evelyn. Not anymore." Her gaze fell to the bandaged hand she still held. "I've been running from grief for so long," she said quietly. "I thought surviving meant keeping myself locked away. But now I see I was wrong." Calder studied her, the intensity of his focus softening into something tender, deliberate. "Surviving isn't just about staying alive," he said. "It's about letting people in, letting someone share the weight, even if it scares you." She looked at him then, really looked, seeing the man who had braved cold, snow, raiders, and ghosts, all while protecting her. And for the first time, she didn't feel the shadow of her past pressing against her chest. She felt warmth. She felt presence. "I don't want to lose you," she admitted, voice barely above a whisper. "You won't," he said firmly. "Not if I can help it. You've earned the right to trust Evelyn, and I've earned the right to stay." A silence settled between them, filled not with grief, but with something fragile and alive, hope. The morning sun fell across the cabin floor, casting long shadows that danced over worn timber and the traces of a long night's fear. For the first time since leaving Hollow Creek, Evelyn let herself relax. Not completely, not yet, but enough to breathe, to feel the steady pulse of life beside her, and to understand that survival could mean more than enduring. It could mean choosing to stay, to hope, to begin again. Calder's hand covered hers, a simple gesture with profound weight. And in that quiet, sunlit moment, she knew the fever had broken, not the illness, not the grief, but the frozen fear inside her heart. They would face the ridge ahead together, and for the first time, she believed she could. The high ridges stretched before them, pale in the early light, snow drifting lazily across sharp edges and hidden gullies. Calder rode ahead, eyes scanning every curve, every shadow, every whisper of movement that might betray the raider's presence. Evelyn followed close behind, reins taut in her hands, heart pounding with a mix of fear and determination. Today, the past and the present would collide. They're close, Calder murmured without looking back, voice low but steady. "I can feel it in the wind, every shift, every gust. Something tells me this ends today." Evelyn's fingers tightened on the reins. "And what if we're not ready?" "You are," he replied, his tone unwavering. "You face the river, the storm, the cold, and the shadow of grief. You're ready, and so am I." The snow crunched beneath their horses' hooves as they descended into the narrow valley, the terrain treacherous and sharp, every step demanding attention. Smoke curled in the distance, faint but unmistakable, markers of the raider gang's camp. Calder's eyes darkened as he recognized the symbol etched into the makeshift flags they'd left fluttering in the wind, the same mark that had haunted his past. "Stay close," he instructed, voice low and commanding. "We do this carefully, quietly, together." Evelyn nodded, chest tight, adrenaline sharpening her focus. She could feel the rhythm of the land, the whispers of the snow, the pulse of the horses beneath her. And beside her, Calder's presence was steady, unwavering, a tether to something stronger than fear. They crept along the ridge, flanking the camp silently. Calder's hand rested near his rifle, muscles coiled for action. Evelyn's breath came in measured gasps, each one a reminder of all she had endured to reach this moment. A sudden move meant two figures leaving the shadows, made her grip tighten. Calder signaled, hand low, and they dropped behind a boulder, hidden from view. The wind shifted again, carrying faint curses and the clatter of boots over frozen ground. Calder whispered, "When I say now, we move. Stay close. Watch each other's backs." The seconds stretched, taut as the rope of a lasso, until finally he nodded toward her, eyes meeting hers for a heartbeat. Now, they surged from cover, swift and precise, surprised their only ally. Gunfire cracked sharply, the sound splitting the valley, echoes bouncing off snow and stone. Evelyn's hands were steady, heart racing, and she realized in that instant that fear had become focus. Calder moved with lethal grace, leading the charge, each motion calculated, each decision weighing life and death. Evelyn followed, shoulder to shoulder with him, finding a rhythm she had never imagined she could. The past that had haunted him, the grief that had haunted her, both collided in a single, unyielding drive for survival and justice. By the time the sun had risen higher, casting pale gold across the ridge, the camp lay silent. The raiders had been routed, their shadowy threat dissolved in the bright morning light. Evelyn stood beside Calder, chest heaving, hair plastered to her face, yet alive in a way she hadn't felt since Hollow Creek. Calder's eyes met hers, a quiet understanding passing between them. "We made it," he said simply. She nodded, almost breathless. "We did, together." And as the wind swept over the ridge, cold but cleansing, Evelyn felt the weight of her past lift slightly. The final trail had been walked, the danger faced, and the choice to survive, and to stand by each other had been made. The valley stretched before them, empty and waiting, and for the first time, hope felt like something they could ride toward unafraid. Dawn arrived pale and trembling, a thin light brushing the frost-covered ridge. The valley below was quiet, almost deceptively so, with only the faint curl of smoke mocking where chaos had once raged. Calder and Evelyn moved cautiously, every step measured, senses alert to the slightest sound. The raiders might have scattered, but one wrong move could bring them back. "You ready?" Calder asked, voice low, eyes scanning the shadows. Evelyn nodded, hand tightening on the reins, "As ready as I'll ever be." They descended the slope together, silent but for the crunch of snow under their horses' hooves. At the edge of the main clearing, the remaining raiders stirred, moving toward the ridge with desperate determination. Calder's jaw tightened. "We end this now." Gunfire erupted. The sharp report split the cold morning air, echoing off the canyon walls. Evelyn felt the first bullet whiz past, close enough to make her flinch, and instinctively she leaned into Calder's side. He didn't flinch, didn't falter. Every movement precise, controlled. "Move," he commanded, leading the charge through the scattered group. Evelyn fired when necessary, hands steady despite the adrenaline, every shot deliberate. She realized in that moment that fear was now a tool, not a paralyzer. Each motion with Calder beside her gave her purpose, clarity. A raider lunged from behind a boulder, and Evelyn saw him too late. But before she could react, Calder was there, shifting, shielding her with his own body. The moment was over almost instantly, the threat neutralized, but her pulse roared in her ears. "You saved me," she whispered, voice trembling. "And you saved yourself," he replied, eyes scanning the last pockets of movement. "We both did." The remaining raiders scattered, their shouts swallowed by the wind. Evelyn and Calder stood in the pale light of dawn, rifles lowered, breaths heavy. The valley lay quiet now, victory etched in the cold morning air. Evelyn let herself exhale fully, feeling the tremor of tension leave her shoulders. I didn't know I could do that," she admitted, voice shaking with disbelief and relief. Calder's hand brushed hers, a grounding touch. "You always could. You just needed the right reason to remember it." The sun rose higher, casting golden light over the ridge, illuminating the valley and the trail they had carved together. Smoke hung faintly, a reminder of what they had endured, but also of what they had survived. For the first time since Hollow Creek, Evelyn felt a spark of true freedom, a sense that the future, uncertain, raw, and demanding, was hers to face. And Calder, steadfast beside her, offered the promise that she would not face it alone. As the morning wind carried the scent of snow and ash, Evelyn realized something vital. Courage was not the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it. And with Calder, she had learned to act without hesitation. The valley was theirs for now, and the dawn, pale and fearless, marked the first true step into what they could build together. The valley stretched wide and quiet under the late morning sun, a blanket of snow softened by the promise of thaw. Evelyn rode slowly, taking in the sight of her homestead, The fences were battered, and the roof sagged in places, but it was still hers, still a place she could call home. For the first time since leaving Hollow Creek, the weight of grief felt tempered by possibility. She dismounted, boots crunching against the frozen earth, and ran her hand over the familiar wood of the cabin. Memories of laughter, sorrow, and life lived here pressed against her heart. It had been a long journey, one that left scars both visible and unseen. Yet she felt the pull of renewal, the chance to mend what had been broken. Calder stayed close, his horse a steady shadow beside hers. He watched her with quiet attention, eyes scanning not just the landscape, but the emotions she couldn't hide. Evelyn noticed it, the subtle pause, the hesitation that spoke volumes. "You don't have to leave," she said softly, almost to herself. "Not unless you want to." He tilted his head, expression unreadable, yet a warmth flickered there. "I was ready to move on," he admitted, "but seeing you here, seeing you alive and strong, it makes leaving harder than I thought." Evelyn's lips curved into the faintest smile. "You could help me rebuild, not just the cabin, but the valley, even just a little." Calder's gaze softened. "Then maybe I will." Together, they walked the property, inspecting fences, leaning on each other as they discussed repairs and plans. The land beneath them was quiet, but alive with possibility, a mirror of the fragile trust slowly growing between them. The snow reflected the sun, blinding and pure, as if the world itself had been washed clean of the violence that had once marked it. Evelyn paused at the edge of the creek, watching water ripple under ice that had begun to melt. "I used to feel trapped here," she admitted, "like the valley itself held me back, but now, it feels like it could carry me forward." Calder's hand brushed hers, lingering, grounding her. "It'll carry us both," he said quietly, "if we let it." A gust of wind swept through the valley, brushing at their coats, ruffling hair, carrying the faint scent of pine and the promise of spring. Evelyn felt something shift inside her, fear tempered by resilience, grief tempered by courage, solitude tempered by the presence of someone she trusted completely. As she turned back to the cabin, she realized that this was more than a home. It was a place to start over, to choose life despite the scars of loss and violence. And Calder, standing just behind her, was no longer merely a protector. He was part of the possibility, part of the future she dared to imagine. For the first time in months, Evelyn allowed herself to hope that the valley could heal, and so could she. Together, they would build again, not just walls and roofs, but trust, courage, and perhaps even love. The sun climbed higher, and for the first time, the valley felt like a promise, not a prison, and Evelyn, with Calder beside her, was ready to keep it. The sun hung low in the sky, a muted orange that cast long shadows across the valley. Evelyn stood at the edge of the homestead, coat pulled tightly around her, breath misting in the cold air. Calder adjusted his saddle, boots crunching softly against the snow, a familiar tension in his posture. He was ready to leave, to ride out into the unknown, and for a moment the thought of watching him go stole her breath. "You're leaving," she said quietly, almost as a question she didn't want answered. He didn't look up immediately, only ran a gloved hand over the saddle, eyes distant. "I thought I should," he admitted. "The road calls, and I can't ignore it forever." Evelyn's fingers itched not for the reins, but for the courage to hold him back. The wind bit at her cheeks, sharp and insistent, and she realized how much the cold had seemed easier with him here all along. Slowly, deliberately, she stepped forward. "Wait," she whispered. Calder paused, glancing at her, expression unreadable. Without another word, she reached out and draped his coat over his shoulders, the fabric heavy but familiar. Her fingers lingered on the collar, a silent plea, a gentle command. "Stay," she said softly. "The wind's easier with two." For a heartbeat, he froze, eyes meeting hers with a mixture of surprise, warmth, and something unspoken. Recognition that what they had built together was stronger than the road or the past. He started, voice low, uncertain. She shook her head, a faint smile curving her lips. "Don't speak. Just stay." The valley stretched around them, vast and silent, the snow glinting pale gold in the fading light. The homestead, the ridge, the river. They were all part of a world they had fought to survive, but this moment belonged to them alone. Calder exhaled slowly, tension leaving his shoulders, and nodded once. He did not mount, he did not ride away. He simply stood there, coat heavy on his back, presence steady beside her. Evelyn's heart swelled with something fragile and unbreakable. Relief, hope, and the quiet recognition that love, like trust, could be built one deliberate gesture at a time. The wind carried a low whistle through the valley, no longer biting, but soft, as if acknowledging the bond forged through snow, fear, and shared survival. Evelyn reached for his hand, and he did not pull away. Together they stood at the edge of the homestead, watching the sun dip behind the ridge. The valley was quiet, the future uncertain, but for the first time the cold didn't matter, not with him there. And in that simple, unspoken promise, Evelyn understood that some coats, some hands, some hearts were meant to be shared. The snow drifted softly around them, and the valley waited, not as a prison, not as a test, but as a place to live, to hope, and to love. The wind was easier with two.